All right. So this is episode 2 of the Of Story and Song podcast featuring author Vesper Stamper, author and illustrator, I might say, Vesper Stamper. She's written such books as What the Night Sings, A Cloud of Outrageous Blue, and her most recent book, Berliners, which just came out a couple weeks ago. So, hi Vesper, how are you today?
I'm doing well, John. How are you?
I'm doing great, doing great. It's a big day today, election day.
Oh
Um,
my.
now, have you already been thinking about that yet? I know you're just kind of starting your day, or is that coming up
Oh
for
yeah.
you?
Oh, I'm here for it, man. I'm ready. And this is my son's first time voting, so I'm taking him tonight. We're going to go together. Actually, we're all going to go as a family, which is so weird.
Oh, that's very cool. Now, is
Yeah.
he 18 or is he like a little older, like
He's
19?
almost 20. He's almost
Okay.
20, but he I think he was just shy of 18. Yeah, he was just shy of 18 at the last election. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I remember I turned 18 right when it was the 2008 um, election with Obama and McCain. So that was a pretty crazy year. And like the
So,
recession was just kind of starting out.
yeah.
So yeah, that was quite a time to have my first voting cycle happen.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, no, it's been interesting. And we could probably, I'm sure our conversation will probably naturally get into that realm a little more kind of as we go. But one of the elements I really wanted to talk to you about, because I think that we're so kind of in line with keeping up, is kind of censorship and totalitarian and how that really plays into your books, but just kind of into your life and how you see things kind of happening in the world around you as an artist. Because as artists, one of the things that just brings so much joy to life and is so ingrained in how we think is not only freedom of speech, but just freedom of thought and freedom of expression. And um, I think censorship and totalitarian systems essentially kind of see the artist as their enemy, or they try to turn art into something else entirely, which would be propaganda.
Right.
So, um, yeah, so I was just curious, as artists, what's an important thing to pay attention to make sure that our work stays pure and doesn't kind of bleed into that gray area of starting to introduce propaganda.
Yeah, well, there's so many ways we could talk about that. I mean,
Hmm.
I think that a lot of the problems that I've said this many times, but a lot of problems that we have as artists these days are really modern problems. And from time immemorial, I mean, until maybe, you know, 500 years ago or so, the artist was just part of the society, an artisan, a member of society serving a function just like anybody else, often anonymous or often just known within their peers, their guild, other artists like them, just like a blacksmith would be, or a farrier or something like that. The artist was not this kind of exalted genius, right? But when we cultivated that in around the time of the Renaissance, we invented this idea of the genius artist. That's, I think, when this started to pull away and fracture. And there were some good things about that because artists started to be able to make much more commentary on their times than they might have used to when they were working within a strict tradition of, say, iconography or manuscript illumination, things like that. But I think that what that did was it set up this kind of antagonism between the society and the artist.
Mm.
And the artist began to be seen much more on the outside of things. And I think the artists already always, I think we're the way we're made, we're always kind of on the outside of things a little bit. That's where inspiration comes from. And that's where, because we're so open and our senses are so, so open to the world all the time, then it is automatically going to set us up against um, the way most people think. And it's neither better nor worse, it's just different. But what's happened in recent history, these totalitarian regimes are actually also something very new.
Mm,
They really were not, we didn't have regimes like this really before the 20th century. You had classical dictatorships like monarchies and you know, different systems like that. But in terms of this totalizing, surveillance state kind of things that we see in places like the USSR, East Germany, Nazi Germany, Franco's Spain, things like that. Um, that is a relatively recent phenomenon, and so is the world of modern propaganda, which really comes out of the advertising world. So again, there's like many, many ways that we could go with this, but essentially, at the end of the day, the artist, you're right, can either serve the function of truth telling and thus not be the friend of the totalizing power, or be co-opted out of fear, really out of fear at the heart of it, to create work for the regime that supports it. And that would be propaganda.
yeah, absolutely. And I remember hearing you talk one time kind of about um, just modernity, and not even as an artist, but just as people's lives, just throughout so much of human history, people have lived very small lives, which is not to say insignificant or meaningless by any means, but just kind
No.
of the scope in which they viewed their purpose, very local to the community and to their family and in their role, which I think almost made their life bigger in a sense, because it's like, here's my purpose. So many people see me. And I think um, being witnessed and being seen is such a huge part of what gives us our existence. And I think that's also at the core of why so many people are struggling and why the lockdowns were so harmful to people. It's because um, all of a sudden they weren't being seen anymore. They're kind of locked away and tucked away. And in a sense, they're seen on the computers and through, the videos they upload, all these TikToks and Instagram type stuff. But um, it's kind of like a half truth. And even if people don't consciously know that, they kind of subconsciously know it, that even if they're getting tons of likes or feel seen in that way, there's the authentic part of them, or the real in the flesh person of them still isn't being seen. So I think such an important part of art is that sense of community, whatever it may be and whatever art form it is, even with writing and even with a novel, being able to have conversations about that. And as an author, being able to speak with the people who are reading your work, I think is such an important part of the conversation and of the art piece. I know for me personally, just when I write and speaking with the people who read my book, I feel like they're just as much a part of the artistic process as my role in it, because every single person kind of takes away from it something new, and in their interpretation they're bringing something new into life from that. So it's really cool to see. Have you had a similar experience, or do you kind of see things the same through people who read your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think any artwork doesn't exist outside of the people who engage with it in a
Hmm.
sense. I mean, of course, that's not totally true. There are the private artworks that we do that really should comprise 90% of what we're doing. So
Yeah.
much of what we do in process, will never see the light of day, and that's as it should be. But,
Hmm.
as you were talking, I was thinking about Jane Austen and how I illustrated a picture book about her a couple of years ago. And I went over to, this was before COVID, I went over to England and kind of traced her footsteps, went to, the villages that she lived in, and went to the, her brother's estate and things. And it was so clear that Jane, who never married, but was still part of this large, bustling family, created all of her artworks within the context of her family. She was able to completely be herself. I mean, I don't think anybody could really read Jane Austen's work and say that she held anything back or that she was not like being her authentic self, or, she's one of the
Hmm.
great writers of our world, the great students of human personality and behavior. But she did this all within a very, very social context. There's a place in her brother's estate where a little window seat where she used to sit in the middle of, I think her brother had, I don't know, 8 children or so. I can't remember exactly, but think of her writing Pride and Prejudice, in the context of all these little kids running around and, the family life, right? And so what modernity has done more and more and more is it's atomized us. We were already in an epidemic of loneliness before lockdowns. If you think of it like, okay, so, events of the recent past had already scattered us into these little atomized particles, right? Wandering around, unconnected, lonely. And then you take all of those atomized particles and then you lock them inside alone, right? And the only interaction that they can have is this, screen to screen kind of thing where it's all mediated by third and fourth and fifth and sixth parties. That's not really, like you're saying, that's not being seen and known and heard. And then, it brings me back to, I know that there's a lot of conversation among artists of faith about these struggles of, having feeling like they have to choose, right? And or that their faith community doesn't understand who they are or what they're doing as artists, right? And so the there's efforts to, okay, like put up an art gallery in the church lobby, or have the artist come and put in an installation in the altar area, or all these really nice, I'm not denigrating those efforts at all, but it sort of misses the point and puts the emphasis on the production of the product rather than the artist being an integral part of the community, both for the sake of the community and for the sake of the artist. Because the artist, as people who do kind of live on the outside, live on the margins of things, like we really need other people to keep us with that one foot in reality. you know Otherwise we can sort of, whether we're introverts or extroverts, we can sort of atomize ourselves, and then we really are susceptible to, to the whims of things like propaganda, whether it's being directed at us or whether we're being asked to make it, or pressured to make it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me of kind of one of your podcast episodes called The Fireborn, where you're talking about kind of the Iron Maiden and Copper Maid, and how
Not
you
Iron
kind
Maiden.
not Iron Maiden,
Not
no.
Iron Maiden.
That's awesome. But no, I really like that because it's like you don't want to be working in like pure tradition or pure what's known or pure kind of chaos, pure monster mode. Kind of want to
Right.
be somewhere in between.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes,
so
that can be an uncomfortable place to be. And it's why artists often feel like we don't fit anywhere, because we don't, but that doesn't mean that we're some sort of like other kind of human or something. We have the same needs that every human has. And I was recently, speaking of my podcast, not to plug my podcast, but I was listening to an episode from season 2 about working motherhood.
mhm.
And this, subject comes up a lot when I talk to students and things, and people wonder, if I'm going to be an artist, do I have to choose between that and a family? And I think, no, that can't be. Artists need family just like everybody else. And one of the healthiest contexts that an artist can have is creating within, the small community of a family, of having responsibilities for other people, and also being cared for, within a family.
Well, yeah, family's so important, and even a lot of the artists, whether it be writers or actors or kind of any field, a lot of the people I look up to the most are always talk about how important family and community and all of that is to them. And I think because it really helps keep them grounded and it keeps them from kind of floating off too much or from indulging in stories and in art forms that take away more than they give, because
Yeah,
when you have family you really understand and integrate the importance of sacrifice and of, like I was talking about earlier, of being seen. If you want to
yeah,
be seen, you integrate yourself with your family, because they will, if you have a good and loving family, they will support you when you're in need, but they will also challenge you when
yeah,
you are falling away from who you really are. Because they'll notice when you start acting different and when you start falling into, whether it be depression or anger or being brainwashed by an ideology or a cult or whatever it may be,
right.
they I mean, when cults are trying to recruit people, what's the first thing they do? They try to
Oh,
isolate people from
yeah,
their family. When all the lockdowns were started, what was the first thing they tried to do was isolate people from
from
work,
their
from,
families.
yeah, from family, from work, from anything that kind of grounds them and gives them a sense of where they're at. Because when you have a family, when you have a community, when you have any of that, it doesn't make your life simple by any means, in the
Right,
sense of, you know, not having complexity, but what it does is it it just really narrows the field and gives you um a working grounds. When someone paints or writes something, they don't just start scribbling on the walls most of the time. They have, the canvas that they work within. So yeah, having those parameters to really give your life structure and meaning is very important.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have several friends who left their marriages over things like that, artists who began to see their spouses as a threat to their ability to make art. And this is just ludicrous. And by the way, those same people are not making more art. They're not doing better since leaving their families. They're just as obscure as they ever were, you know,
Hmm.
just without the support. And I mean, far be it from me to judge what goes on in someone's home, but these are the reasons given. I'm saying these are the reasons that these people gave for leaving their marriages. And the artist, when as artists, as I said before, like we're so open to the world that really anything could come in and convince us, any sort of whispering voice to say, oh, if you could just, dump this person, if you could just, hand your kids over to somebody else, or like, it makes the art an idol that will never be satisfied. It just will never be satisfied. And it
Exactly.
cannot satisfy. It can't.
Exactly. Yep.
I've had a fairly successful career. I'm happy with where I'm at. I've been doing this for 25 years, but there is nothing that compares to my kids and my husband. There's nothing. It- You know, um, at the end of the day, like you put a book out into the world and it has a life of its own. And, I think we like to say that our art is our children and things like this, but that's not really true because the art, at the end of the day, the project is over and you release it into the hands of the viewers or the readers, and they take it and run with it, and your influence is largely over.
Right.
And also that work, once it's done, it can't really speak back to you,
Hmm.
except once in a while you'll pull it out of the drawer and you'll kind of give it another look, and maybe you get a little buzz or you get a feeling about it, but that's not the same as having a human relationship. Um so I think as artists, we can really get into our own heads so easily. And it's actually something that we need to fight against. It doesn't make the work better to be isolated and alone.
Hmm.
It makes the work better to have more human contact because no matter what discipline you're working in, you're a storyteller. You're telling the story of the world that you inhabit. And to isolate yourself and cut yourself off, it doesn't serve the work at all.
Right. And when, because I feel like it's almost putting, when you're talking about letting it become an idol, it's almost putting, I wouldn't even say putting freedom as an idol, but putting the idea of what freedom is as
Right.
an idol. Because I think freedom's so important. I love freedom. I spend my life, I would say, fighting for freedom in
Hmm.
whatever form that may be. But
Same.
for me, freedom is not being um, boundless. To me,
Right.
freedom is being able to willingly choose what to bind yourself to,
That's a good way of looking at it. Yeah.
because that idea of kind of being boundless kind of doesn't make sense if you like really actually try to pin it down. Because even someone who might sell everything and just hit the road and say I'm free, you're still bound by um, whatever your finances are, your bodily needs to eat. You're
Right.
still bound by your mortality. There's still so many things. So um, being able to really pay attention and um, prioritize your values, I think, is what allows for freedom. Because then all of a sudden, it's what really leads into, because I know that you're a Christian as well, and it's
Yes.
something that over time, it I'm sure you feel the same. Over time, it's just such a beautiful thing to see how truth is unveiled to us rather than kind of discovered. I never necessarily feel like I'm discovering truth. I always feel like it's revealed to me at
Yeah.
times when I'm ready to accept it.
I
And I
agree.
feel
Yeah.
like freedom is very similar. Freedom, I feel free kind of when I'm in that state of contentment in my heart where I'm ready to see it as being free. The whole time, if you're in a marriage, the whole time it can be a very freeing thing, or it can be a very, um,
Contentious.
yeah, contentious thing
Yeah.
where you feel trapped, but it kind
Right.
of depends on both the effort that's being put into it and then how you're seeing it. A saying I really like is, um, a prison can be a monastery, or a monastery can be a prison.
Mm.
Um,
Who said that? That's great.
I'd have to look it up. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I love
I
that. I'm getting
yeah.
to know more monks lately.
Hmm.
So this is apropos. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. The thought of freedom, right? It's not freedom to, you know, the Hindu goddess Kali has freedom, right, to destroy,
Hmm.
and so do we. You know, but I think it's less a matter of freedom as free will. You know, if we think of free will, to me, I don't know, when I say those words, they kind of automatically bring with them the sense of responsibility. Like I've been given free will, I've been given the ability to choose. It's not, I've been given the freedom to do whatever I want. You know, um,
Yeah.
my husband and I have this inside joke. We just, it's a free country. I can do what I want.
Yep.
But when you think about the subject of free will, that is something that I think we kind of sense that we have been given, like you're saying. It's revealed to us that, oh, I can choose this or that. I can choose life or death. I can choose to entrap myself or entrap somebody else, or I can choose to allow them to breathe, and making those choices out of what you're saying, contentment, you know, if we handle our free will responsibly within our own lives, personally, starting with ourselves, looking at ourselves and saying, okay, what are the choices before me and what are the ramifications of those going to be on myself, on the people around me, and operating accordingly, you can make the choices that lead to your contentment, to your peace and to your rest, and to surround yourself with people who are life-giving to you and who don't just tell you yes all the time. When I say life-giving, I don't mean they agree with you all the time. Like you're saying, in a
Mhm.
family, there's there's challenge, there's people have the right to hold your feet to the fire and to hold you to your word and make sure you keep your promises. And um, that's really important, And the other thing you were talking about with having an eye toward our mortality really struck me as an artist, because this is something that I think as a world, actually, we're very, very disconnected from death and from our own mortality and from the cost of our actions to the people around us in terms of their mortality. Now, I want to I want to qualify that, because one of the things that happens in totalizing systems is one of the messages that we're given is do XYZ, it's for the common good, right? And
Right.
really what that means is this is what the collective demands. And I don't jive with that. I don't do the collective, right?
And it almost
I
tries to set itself up as we will protect you
Right.
from
Will be
death
your
almost.
family.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll protect you from death. Right. Right. Right.
Hmm.
Exactly. It's those people over there that are going to kill you. And you're
Hmm.
hearing a lot of this rhetoric right now around the election. Like, if you don't vote for us, your children will die. It's like, what? Oh,
Hmm.
how far off the path have we gotten? It's an election, guys. Like, we have the right to vote. We have a two-party system. I'm not interested in a one-party state. That's when people die, is when we get a one-party state. I don't want that. It's
Yeah.
like break up the hard ground as often as possible, like keep it moving, keep it fluid, keep it going, whatever. But that's a tangent.
Hmm.
But in terms of an eye toward our own mortality, like this gives us a sense of like, oh, I have responsibility toward myself, toward the people around me, toward my immediate community, you know, small c community. And that community could be made up of people who are radically different than I am. Community is not like single interest, okay? It's like messy. A family is a community, a town is a community, a faith, a church community is a community,
Hmm.
um, but like this common good collective thing, that's not a community. That's a collective. It's very, very different. I keep getting off on different tracks, but okay. So bring it back to so
Real
one
quick,
of
I
the,
just want to say, just two
yeah,
seconds, that's such an important distinction between community and collective.
yes,
Um, I think people just simply do not think about that distinction, but that's
no,
so big. Yeah.
yeah. And we could talk definitely more about that. But, you know, in the, um, in the Middle Ages, around the time of the plague, and, this is the subject of my second book, A Cloud of Outrageous Blue, is
Hmm.
the 1348 plague. And that came out in 2020, like totally unplanned. Okay. We didn't know the pandemic was coming. It came out the same year.
Hmm.
And so it was like playing out before my eyes. And one of the things that came out of this experience of the plague, of literally like half the population dropping dead within 3 days, that is not what we experienced in COVID. Okay. Like we're talking high, high, high mortality that decimates your society and fundamentally reinvents it. I mean, we've had a taste of that, but this is on a level you can't even imagine. And so, what artists did was they began to depict death as a personified being. So, you see in manuscript illuminations, in paintings that came out after, you can see this in Holbein. This was a trope that came out a lot during a lot of the Northern European painters, the Flemish painters, were overtly depicting this, but people, even just the average person, would carry around with them a memento mori, like a little pin, or a, even you could consider it a talisman, something like that, but just a reminder. It might be a skull, it might be, you know, a memento mori, remember death. This was constantly present because you couldn't be removed from death all around you. In the pre-modern world, before you had things like hygiene. All right. I think we don't give hygiene enough credit. Hand washing and things like that. Before that, I mean, people really, you were lucky if you lived past the age of 5.
Yeah.
Anything could take you out. And so your connection to that, and your sense of um, accountability before your maker and in the community that you lived in was really, really heightened. This is something that I think we really do not live with today, and we really should.
Oh, I agree. And it's something, especially when you're talking about memento mori, it's something I've been really trying to focus on and kind of understand lately. There's a really amazing short story I read years and years ago, written by a Japanese short story author. And it was called The Closest Town to Heaven.
Mm,
And the main character, so it's kind of a collection of short stories told through the eyes of one main character who is like an immortal warrior. So he's an immortal kind of mercenary warrior
mm,
who's been all over kind of fighting for various causes. But he comes across a city called the closest town to heaven. And the people there die very young. So like early 20s, something like that. But then because of that, they also have a lot of babies to try to make up for the people who are passing away. But he
wow,
noticed that they're always so full of life and dancing. And out of everywhere he's traveled, he just sees how full of life they are compared to everywhere else. And when he's talking to someone, and they all have like this um, snack that they like, which is like some frozen ice drink or something made from like the recent or not recent, like local lake or water reservoir or something like that.
hmm,
So he's talking to someone, asking why the bells keep ringing so often, and the person says, "Well, we ring the bells every time someone's born and every time someone passes away,
wow,
um, so that when someone hears them, they only think of it as joyous because we're only here for a brief time and then pass on to the next world. So we never know whether someone's coming or going,
wow,
um, because they ring so often." And kind of the dark, the dark part to it, and what makes it really interesting to me is um, when the immortal guy he takes a sip from the water, or he tries that frozen water drink, and he tastes poison in it. So he sees that it was like tainted
wow,
with something, and it's been like tainted. He's probably for a while, and that's probably what's been leading so many people to become sick or kind of die over time.
right.
And he's left with that drama of,
Do I tell them or not?
do I tell them or not, and change the entire way of which they live their life? And I think it kind of ends ambiguously.
Wow.
But I just remember I've read that story probably 12 years ago, and it still sticks
Yeah.
with me.
Yeah. Well, that's what good art does, right?
Hmm.
Presents you with questions that propel you through your whole life. Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's amazing.
a short story, probably just a
Yeah,
thousand, 2,000 words, and
right.
just like hits you right in the gut.
Oh, I've really got to read that.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. Um, oh, something I wanted to ask you about when we were
Yeah.
talking about um, freedom of freedom of choice. Have you read the book East of Eden?
I started to read it around the time I started to write Berliners because I knew that it was a Cain and Abel retelling,
Hmm.
but I stopped myself because I have a rule that when I'm writing a book, I don't read much fiction at all, but I
Okay,
especially don't read any fiction that has, like, a relationship to what I'm writing,
gotcha.
because I don't want it to, it's inevitable that it will influence, you know,
Hmm.
and I don't wanna be accused of either plagiarism or, I just I wanna let that work be what it is, so I
Right.
started to, and I really loved it. I will pick it up now that I've finished Berliners. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good rule too. But yeah, East of Eden is my favorite book of all time. So when I saw
Wow.
you were writing a book kind of in similar scope with Cain and Abel, and when we were talking about freedom of choice in East of Eden, they highlight a word called timshul, um, which means thou mayest, um,
Hmm.
which comes from um, like the original Hebrew of the Cain and Abel story.
Huh.
And I believe it's when God is talking to Cain, um, and it's not really a condemnation of him. I think it's God says, "Thou mayest," as if like you going out now from here on out, you can choose what you give to me, what you do with your life. It's up to you.
Yeah.
You have the choice, and it's such an important kind of theme throughout the story. It's you have the choice
Yeah.
of what to do. And I think your story is so important with the time we're living in right now because I heard you talking in another interview, which I thought was really cool about fractal division happening through the story, whether it's through, kind of the Berlin Wall splitting East and West Germany, and then moving on to the splits in a community, down to the splitting of a family, the splitting of brothers, and into, the splitting of someone's own psyche.
Yeah.
And it's really that distinction between fractal division, um, and then its opposite, which is fractal forgiveness and unity and kind of coming together. Because even if you think about things in, just a biological way, what is death? It's um, kind of the disintegration, it's the division of your cells over time. It's everything kind of falling apart and dispersing. Whereas kind of the promise of eternal life is asking for forgiveness and repentance and turning away from all that which leads to division and kind of reconciles and brings everything back to God and that source of light and creation and all that. So for you
Yeah.
personally, writing this book,
Beautifully said, by the way. Yeah.
thank you. But just writing this book, how strong was that thought of division kind of throughout the whole entire process and just based off what you're seeing in your own world? Because anytime someone writes something, it's no matter what time period it may be, it comes from our heart and from our minds, and so much of that comes from the world we're living in.
Yeah, I mean, I started the project with these questions of, after I wrote What the Night Sings, which was about the Holocaust, about the Jewish experience post-war. The natural next question is, well, what happened to the Nazis,
Hmm.
And, when you go back to Germany today, as an outsider, I mean, I was born there, but I'm not German. I um, didn't go back till just a few years ago when I was writing What the Night Sings. And as an outsider, you go there and you feel it. You feel the history there. You feel that even if the people that you're passing on the street are not overtly conscious and thinking all the time about their nation's history. I mean, like, none of us really, who walks around thinking about their nation's history all the time? Not many people.
Mhm.
But nevertheless, it's in the atmosphere, and you can't help but wondering, who am I passing right now? What's their history? What's their family's history? What have they experienced? This is another human being walking next to me. We like to think of our enemies as monsters, but it's not that easy. They're people that had choices just like we did. And so did their ancestors, so did our ancestors. So, you start out a project with one question, and then it quickly begets all of these other questions. And so when you're dealing with something like the Berlin Wall, it's like, oh, that was only 16 years after the war ended. What? you know, why did that happen? How did the country get there? Okay, it was divided right after the war into these four sectors. Okay, well, what did that mean? What did it mean and when I say fractal division, I mean, yeah, in the Cold War, the world was divided east and west. I'll just clarify that for anyone who didn't hear that. But then Germany was divided east and west. Then Berlin was divided east and west. Lastly, you come to this family that's on the brink of division. And then these twins. And then these people individually who are making their choices and are reckoning with themselves and with their past, whether that's the parents or the kids. And so all of these tropes of division kept coming up and coming up and coming up, one of which being the fact that the civil rights movement was just getting into full swing in 1961 as the Berlin Wall was going up. And over here, the division between black and white and segregation, reckoning with that. The events that we're seeing now, where we're having another iteration of that reckoning, and the desire to resegregate. Strong desire to resegregate among different people for all different sorts of reasons.
Mm.
Whether out of hate or whether out of pain. So yeah, I mean, it's something that you just start to see the world through the lens of your work in some sense, and you see all the ways in which the world is divided, into even into talk of binary, non-binary, or black and white. Like,
Mhm.
there's so many different ways that we want to parse the world to make it safer, and it just can't be. Like you said, like, that's the way of death. That
Right.
disintegration, like, even death, if you think about, the separation of soul and body, that's unnatural.
Mhm.
Like, that's not the state we're going to be living in forever. That's a temporary state. That's the reason why we grieve when somebody passes. So I just lost my grandmother in July, and I'm finding it impossible to grieve her.
Mm.
I'm just stuck. I am so stuck because there's something in my psyche that cannot believe that her soul is not in her body anymore. I can't reconcile myself to that. Um, all I can think of is, I'm going to see her again,
Yeah.
and her soul will be in her body when I see her. But right now, it's like that separation is too hard for me, to bear. And I don't want, um, I don't want separation, even from people that I don't really like. I have, um, I have relationships that are not whole, you know,
Mhm.
and that's a source of grief for me. It's not a source of relief. Um, Even from people who have really hurt me, I would so much rather that those things be healed than that they sort of just be cut off. Um, I'm not saying if somebody's like actively hurting you or harming you that you shouldn't, you know, break that off. That's not my point. Um, but I think, I started to see repentance a bit differently about a year ago. I started to see it as not the guy standing on the milk crate in the middle of Times Square saying repent, you know,
Mhm.
shame, wagging the finger. You're a horrible, evil, bad person. Yes, we are horrible, evil, bad people. I concur. Okay, um, but repentance just means turning, like you said it before, turning away, right? But what are we
Mhm.
turning to? What are we turning to when we repent? We're turning to life. We're turning toward life itself, or I should say life himself.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and that's glorious. And so when somebody is in error or is in deep sin, we this is what it means to love your enemy. It's not to wish them dead. It's not to wish them to go away. It's not to wish them uh, to be locked up in a gulag, or to have the FBI come after them or whatever it may be. That's not loving your enemy. Loving your enemy can be this person needs to go to jail and account for their crimes. Yes, that is true. That can be true.
Mhm.
But what loving your enemy means is I want that person to repent. I want that person to turn toward life and make choices that lead to life, not that lead to their destruction or other people's destruction. It's really actually it's the most loving thing that you can hope for somebody is that they repent,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. Because when I think about it too, a lot of how I try to meet people and talk to people these days, in this specific case, I'm thinking more towards either people who might not believe in God, or who do, but who kind of don't see how that could be the narrow path, or why they should choose a narrow path.
Right.
And I think how I try to describe it most of the time is, when you think of all the infinite complexity and different routes that life can take, to some people that seems very exciting. And again, talking about freedom, what they view freedom as is, oh, I can do whatever I want. I have so many choices. This is what life is all about. Um, if something doesn't work out, I can just throw it away and go get something else. And I think
Right.
that's such a huge part of our time, especially just materially and being able to purchase things. Oh, this
Yeah.
thing doesn't suit my needs anymore. Oh,
Yeah.
this relationship doesn't suit my needs anymore.
Right.
Either I have, or I think that I have so many options just waiting around the corner for me.
Oh,
And it's really over time where people start to realize that's not really the case.
yeah.
It's more so kind of when you're young and you're kind of, um, even with your brain, kind of have that messiah complex. I'm going to change the world. Everything's possible.
Right.
All that type stuff. But a dream I had just a few weeks ago, and I wrote it down right here. I woke up and just felt such an immense sense of peace. And
Mm,
here's what I wrote. All of my life, I've felt like I've been searching to find something, but it is our Father in heaven who has found me and given me
mm,
rest.
mm.
And I forget exactly what the dream was, but I think even just creatively, just always kind of wanting to push the boundaries, or find truth, find this is going to be the story that answers everything. This is going to be the story that makes this crazy world all make sense. And
Mm.
trying to take everything kind of on my shoulders, in a way that I'm not supposed to be,
Yeah.
or trying to yeah, just um I'd call it, I wouldn't call it totalitarianism, but sometimes we can kind of trick ourselves and want to be everything by ourselves. And I think that that's where people run into confusion, because God God showed himself to us through service. Out of everything he could have came down to be, he could have came down as a king and given everyone money and set up a government. He could have done
Right.
all these things. He could have wrote books and books and books. He could have done so many of the things that we associate with, power and value these days, but he
Yeah.
came down simply to serve, and after service saying, now go and do likewise, and don't tell people what I did. And that's
That's
so much
amazing.
of, yeah, so much of his service was, this is between us. The earth might not see what I've done, but all
Mhm.
of heaven will see what I've done, you know.
Yeah, I was having lunch with a friend of mine who's a monk the other day,
Hmm.
and I was telling him that I don't I don't know why I was looking this up. It was for I had a work related reason I was looking this up. Okay. What I'm about to tell you, so don't get freaked out. But
Okay.
yeah, I don't put any stock in the zodiac or anything like that, but I had to look up my Chinese zodiac sign.
Okay.
Okay. And I was born in 1977, but I was born just before the Lunar New Year. So my birth year is technically 1976 in this calculation. And so I am a fire dragon. Okay. It's like life imitates art. Um,
Hmm.
and I couldn't stop laughing, you know,
Yeah.
because this is very definitely a part of my personality. Um, and it's something that I find hard to reconcile because on the one hand, I am very much the fire dragon. I mean, I rein it in 90%, I will say. But there's a big skull cracker within me. Okay. there's a big fire breathing in your face, intimidating bulldozer, whatever you want to say, okay, that lives inside of me. And that is the part of me that has fire shut up in my bones, that feels that I must tell the truth because I will have to account to God for not telling the truth.
Hmm.
And so that informs my art in a very great way. Part of the restraint with that, though, is like if you want to tell a good story, you can't be the fire dragon all the time. Sometimes you have to be the little garter snake, or sometimes you have to be a kitty cat, or
Hmm.
um, or sometimes you have to be the romantic poet. Like you have different modes. But sometimes when I'm in fire dragon mode, um, I know that that is work that I've been called to do. And yet at the end of it, I often feel exhausted. I feel down, and I feel like I I want to become invisible. I want to like, okay, sometimes I'm Smog, and then sometimes I want to just be Bilbo wearing the ring. Okay.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, and so what that means, and I was, telling my friend this, who I know, is on his face, literally on his face for a large part of the day in his vocation. After I come out of that fire dragon mode, all I want to do is be on my face before God. I don't want to be seen. I want to be nothing. Um, Now I forget exactly why I brought this up, but no, I do, because you said he came among us as one who serves, and that's the artist's vocation, is one of service. It's not one of superstar, it's not one of diva, influencer, you know, a
Right.
million followers. Um,
Because it's like if I ever start thinking about what does the quote unquote audience want, what's going to be marketable, what's going to
right.
be all that stuff, it just starts to disintegrate any creative
Yes.
idea I have, because I'm very much a writer similar to you. I write stories out of the complexity of human beings rather than,
Yeah.
specific plot centric, or like, huge
Yeah.
fantasy worlds or anything like that, which isn't to say anything against those stories.
No,
It's just
no.
it's the
That's a
type,
different genre.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's
It's
just
a
the
different
type of
approach.
kind of writers
Yep.
that we are.
Yeah.
Because when you start to write a story, it's such a beautiful and kind of terrifying thing when you realize how infinitely complex human beings are.
Yes.
Because not only, if you were just writing about one person, just that person's life with no interactions with other people, but you have one infinitely complex person starting to combine their actions with all these other complex people, and it's kind of like you say, it's like it can be overwhelming, and when you're like, where's this story going to go? There's so many different ways it can go based off, and if especially if you're writing a good character, there
Yeah.
you're going to surprise yourself quite a few times based off the way that the story goes.
Right.
And it it's really about finding that balance between kind of letting the actions flow freely, but also being able to contain the narrative in a way that makes sense and doesn't just kind of keep floating off into kind of past the borders into um, just random events
Yeah,
and
I mean,
stuff like that.
this is why we don't like simple villains. This is why we find simple villains boring. You know,
Hmm.
the mean old baddie who's just all mean and bad, like that character is boring. It might work in a small context, or something like that, but it's much more interesting if you're writing a novel or if you're doing a movie or something like that, or you're writing a series. Um, to try to understand how the villain became that way. I mean, this is why there's, podcasts about, what is it, Serial. I've never listened to Serial, but I imagine that that's part of, or, what was that one? Doctor, it was a Dr. Death. Um, I can't remember, about the surgeon who
Oh,
wound up killing a lot of people because he wasn't actually qualified. Oh
I think
my
so. Yeah.
gosh, that was incredible,
Yeah.
because the whole series was all about his psychology, but how somebody could allow themselves to be to get into that situation. And that's what we find fascinating as readers. We want to understand that human psychology. And I think people who, and this is the discipline for us as writers, right? Like those of us who are more character driven and more like psychology driven, like that,
Hmm.
we need the scaffolding of plot in order to give that parameters to make the story have a flow and be interesting, because we could just
Yep.
go on endlessly writing character observations, right?
Yep. Yep.
um and so like we need like save the cat and the post-it notes and all of that, like I said, scaffolding. But then, people who are writing really straight ahead thrillers or whatever, or like, or just like fantasy, sometimes those can go on forever in terms of plot, and yet you never get a sense of the depth of the character. So
Right.
that's their discipline, is like they need a little bit of what we do, we need a little bit of what they do, um, to learn from each other. But
Yeah. And it's very helpful for me too to kind of, after like a first draft, give it to other people to read,
mhm,
because inevitably there's going to be a few parts where they're like, what in the world is going on?
yes,
And that's where I like to kind of see where the common places are.
right,
And then that's when I really start to kind of form my story, as I say, okay, well, they really like kind of these middle sections, but like the
hmm,
beginning and the ending, they're like, where did this story come from and where did it just end?
yeah,
Because a lot
yeah,
of the times with me,
mhm,
with the character stories, that's where I have the biggest kind of problems, is the start in the end,
Right.
especially with the one I'm doing now, because um, I think especially nowadays, it's just literary fiction, but I'm planning it for it to be a trilogy, which nowadays I associate trilogies more so kind of with like fantasy or sci-fi
Right.
and stuff. So it's yeah, it's a very interesting and kind of perplexing problem to try to think of how to end a literary fiction book
Hmm.
in a way for the first book that isn't like a way that just like ends out of nowhere and doesn't conclude anything, but
Right.
also isn't like hokey or anything like that.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah, so
it's
it's
very hard. Yeah, I mean, I picture all of my books as trilogies, and in fact, Berliners is the second in what I envision to be
mhm,
a trinity, a trilogy. No,
yeah,
it's not. Forgive me. Um, but yeah, I mean, I always think of books in threes like that because I think that there's just different facets to a character has the arc within the book, but then that's not the end of their story. They had a story before, they have a story after,
right,
you know, or different characters didn't get to tell their full story, which is what Berliners, ultimately why that got written.
right. And it's cool actually. We're kind of somewhat writing similar characters. I'm excited to finish Berliners. I know we have book club coming up
Hmm.
tomorrow, so I'm excited to talk about the book and everything. But one of your main characters in this book is a photographer, and it's the same thing in the book I'm writing right now. It's um, I love writing stories about the dynamic kind of between two characters where it goes back and forth. I really love kind of just balancing or getting different perspectives. And in mine, it is a photographer as one of the main characters, and then his wife, who is a ballet dancer.
Hmm.
And it's something I've been plotting and kind of just writing a little bit for like 5 years.
Wow.
And just having that amount of time just adds
Oh,
such like
I
a
wish I had that amount of time. It's
I,
such a luxury.
I never would have imagined having that amount of time or even taking that amount of time, but it's
Hmm.
just I think I just respected the characters too much, or I was just so intrigued by everything too much.
Yeah.
And it it leads into all the research and things that I want to know in life
Right.
anyway with the story. So like um it just all kind of combined in that way because with the photographer, his life is spent so much just observing people and kind of trying to slow down time and to freeze it and to examine it. And I really associate him kind of with like the scientific
Hmm.
worldview. And then
Hmm.
with the ballet dancer, it's very traditional and movement based and intimate and kind of structured. And it it's basically the unfolding of time. So it's not freezing time, but it's living
Yeah.
within time and with music. So it's cool um, playing with their worlds and seeing how they interact with each
Yeah.
other.
Yeah. You're gonna like book club this week because I actually talk quite a bit about that.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's kind of an integral aspect to the story of Cain and Abel is
Mm,
the role of technology.
yeah.
So you'll find that interesting, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Vesper, for joining me. I'm sorry my uh, video cut out partway through. But yeah, this has been an amazing conversation. I just respect you so much, and I was so excited to, have this conversation with you and get to talk about things a little bit more. So, to anyone who's listening, please check out not only all of Vesper's books, but her podcast as well, or any YouTube search, Spotify search, any platform. I promise pretty much anything you click on is gold. So
Well, thanks. High praise. Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. All right, Vesper. Well, God bless, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Awesome.
All
Take
right,
care.
bye.
Bye, John.